Welcome to the Voice of Retail podcast. I'm producer and host Michael LeBlanc, and this podcast is produced in conjunction with Retail Council of Canada. Meet Teanne Porten, Executive Director, ESG Advisory Services, KPMG Canada, who joins me on the mic with an interview that pulls apart ESG letter by letter and then puts it back together again with a clear articulation of the modern imperatives that every retailer needs to understand and master to be the employer of choice and compete and win with today's consumers. Teanne, welcome to the Voice of Retail podcast. How are you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much, Michael. How are you doing today?
I am wonderful. I'm happy to have you on the mic. We had a couple of little gremlins over the past week, but we have solved them. You sound amazing. So we're all set. We are ready to go. I've been looking forward to this for several weeks. So thanks again for joining me on the mic. Let's start at the beginning. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and what you do for a living.
Thanks. I'm super happy to be here. So thanks very much for having me on your podcast. This is very exciting. I am the Executive Director for ESG Services at KPMG Canada and also the Regional Consumer and Retail Industry Lead. I'm also a member of the Retail Council of Canada's ESG Working Group. And I have about 20 years of experience working across industries, mostly developing and enhancing strategies and roadmaps to address ESG and climate-related risks and opportunities.
Now, looking at your LinkedIn, you have a deep background in ESG. How did you find yourself in that path? I mean, sometimes the opportunity presents itself. Like, were you always interested in this broad topic, or did you just kind of find your way looking at the opportunity and the evolution and the development of this category? Like, when you're in school, did you want to be in business? If we start there and just talk about that a little bit.
Actually, when I was in school, I always had a fascination for environmental issues. Mm-hmm. So I did get my first graduate degree in environmental studies with a business and sustainability specialty. But then when I started working for a large food retailer at the time, I realized very quickly that you can't do much with just an environmental perspective for business to actually elicit change in business. You have to speak the language. So I went back and did my MBA, and I found it was a really great combination of having both the environmental studies background as well as the business background so that you could sell your points clearly to leadership in an organization. I started more on the carbon trading side of things and kind of worked my way through energy policy over to the retail side and did some real estate as well, and then worked for an ESG risk rating provider as well. So I definitely have many different perspectives from different angles. So I think that's really helped us develop our team here at KPMG.
Well, it's super interesting, right? I mean, a generation ago, there was not your job. I mean, that's why I'm just kind of delving into a little bit of your background just for people to understand how you developed your expertise. Let's talk briefly about KPMG. Everybody, I can't imagine many people would not know of KPMG, but they may not know the scope and scale, particularly in Canada. And then zero in on the ESG practice. What does that look like, and what's its scope and scale?
KPMG is a global organization providing audit, tax, and advisory services. And in Canada, we have 47 offices and almost 10,000 employees now, and provide services for 2,400 retailers in Canada and 76% of the retail sector companies on the Fortune 1000 in US, making us the leading provider to the retail sector in Canada and globally. In particular, in ESG, we have about 1,000 SMEs globally who provide ESG and climate transformation and value creation support, as well as reporting and assurance services to help companies at every stage of their ESG journey.
Nice. And for the listeners, the SME is a subject matter expert, right? Have I got that right?
Yes, that's right. Sorry. There's a lot of acronyms in this business.
Let's talk about another acronym. 3 letters, big scope. Let's take it a letter at a time. ESG. Break it down for us, because it's one of those terms that I think everyone has heard. But let's put some definition and let's put some parameters around it.
Sure. So E is environmental issues, and those could be anything from climate change, sustainable products, sustainable packaging, water, waste, circularity. S is social, so there are any issues related to communities, diversity, equity, and inclusion, talent and culture, human rights, labor practices. for example, and the G is the governance. So looking at issues there such as corporate governance, ethical behavior, risk management, business resilience, and privacy and data security.
All right, so let's take one on and a little bit with a follow-up question for each. So environmental, like there's a lot of work going on. We see it in the paper every day. It's kind of a eclectic and a little bit esoteric around environmental policy. How much of your work is on advising and your team advising on compliance to the money, governmental, I mean, it's municipal, provincial, and federal. So I'm glad you have 47 offices because it's very complex. Stakeholder relations and just laws compared to leadership to get ahead and benefit with their customers. So talk about the environmental practice a little bit.
Sure. I'd say our work involves both on the compliance side and the strategy side. Compliance regimes and climate disclosure standards have not yet been finalized. However, many companies come to us to understand and really get ahead of compliance regulations and requirements. And then on the other hand, companies also reach out for support on other ESG and climate objectives. For example, to develop climate strategies, to determine gaps in best practices, things like that as well. So I'd say it's definitely a good balance of both. Sometimes compliance gets them in the door, and then we help them more on the strategy side as well.
Right. So sometimes compliance keeps them out of trouble, but that's just kind of a starting point, right? That's kind of like
more of a starting point to really understand any major blind spots that a company has.
Right. Do you see that as I mean, there's table stakes and then there's differentiators. Where do you see that fitting in? I mean, I guess at one point it's just table stakes, but can you be a differentiator in ESG and particularly around the environment?
I think you can be a differentiator 100%. And it's interesting because I would say a lot of the clients that we're getting right now are very curious to see what their stakeholders are expecting in terms of investors, community, customers, and more increasingly their employees. But there's also a lot of interest in seeing what their peers are doing. So I find we do a lot of gap analysis on how the current company is performing based on their own performance in comparison to peers. So then once they see those gaps, I think it's up to the client to understand whether they want to be part of that pact and go with them, or do they want to stand out and go above and beyond that to really the best practices in the industry. And we help clients determine what those best practices are for their industry and help them figure out what ambition level they're interested in achieving.
Oh, I like that. The ambition level. I mean, whether you want to be a fast follower or a leader, right?
Yeah, exactly.
There's money or capital or personal capital to be spent in both. Let's talk about social for a bit. How is the social positioning of firms working for retailers? Retailers are every day tell me that finding and keeping great people is important, and culture starts, above compensation. They all kind of adjust compensation or do what they need to do. But what are you seeing and what are you hearing in terms of, being a good social actor is playing? What role is that playing, do you think, with retailers and acquiring and retaining their people?
Research has actually shown that it is a big component of it. Employee retention has been correlated with corporate sustainability. A recent MIT article stated that embedding climate and sustainability across an organization and its decision-making can improve employee retention and talent attraction, as well as employee satisfaction. So really what we're seeing is the bottom line is that companies aligned with personal values are being sought as employers, as well as companies who value diversity, equity, inclusion, and well-being. Right.
People are migrating more to those with to be employers of choice, and part of being an employer of choice is to have that that element kind of both well buttoned down,
values.
Yeah, and well articulated too, right? I mean, that's part of a challenge is how do you articulate it and not look like you're, I don't know, what's the right word, boasting, right? How do you establish that? I'm sure you hear that from your clients is I want to make sure I'm where I need to be, but I also don't want to brag about it because then it feels like it takes it a step backwards. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, that's a fair statement. And I think maybe the word you're not trying to say is greenwashing. And there's definitely a lot of media attention on that right now of what companies should be saying or what they are saying in comparison to what they're actually delivering. So what we encourage companies and clients to do is definitely to be cautious of what you are stating and stay away from more of that storytelling, up in the sky sort of conversations, and focus more on what are your actual targets? What are your metrics? What do you actually believe in? And how are you demonstrating that you are doing what you say you're doing? So on the employee equity and diversity side, if you say that you really believe in DEI and then you look at their reports and you realize, no, there's no diversity in leadership, then you're not actually practicing what you preach. So it's good to always make sure what you're stating, you're backing it up with evidence.
Let's pivot a little bit to talk about sustainability. We're all trying to get our arms around it one way, shape, or another. Sometimes it's one step forwards, two steps back, and in between science and what we do, and initiatives that you call, you mentioned greenwashing, but we worry about initiatives that don't take in the full life cycle, maybe too simplistic, and yet if it's too complex, it kind of overwhelms consumers. Like, do we understand what our North Star is, the point of arrival in sustainability? How do you think about that?
Our ultimate North Star is attaining the world's most important climate goal, which is limiting the Earth's warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So actual progress and change to meet this target in terms of a lower carbon or net zero transition should be in business plans.
Well, let's unpack those business plans a little bit around sustainability initiatives. I mean, there's both focus on how retailers do business with their partners and how they do business with the consumers. So what are the key initiatives for retailers that will actually make a difference, move to that North Star? Is electrifying the delivery fleet, is it achievable? Is it a worthy goal? Do we understand, is electric truly better than carbon gas? Fast chargers for consumers in parking lots to encourage EVs. What really matters, and what are you hearing, and what's your advice?
3 key initiatives that make a difference to partners and consumers. You're correct. The first one is EV chargers in retailer parking lots. Really, with 74% of new car sales in North America predicted to be electric by 2040, accommodating this will be increasingly important to retailers. There are case studies that have shown that retail dwell times increased due to EV charging sessions and provided increased revenue. So that is addressing both on the partner side and on the consumer side in terms of addressing customers' evolving expectations of having charging as an amenity, and also progressing towards the low carbon economy and improving retail brand value and revenue. A second initiative is replacing physical samples with digital tools. So we're definitely seeing a move towards digitalization. Businesses can produce less waste by implementing augmented reality, for example, to help consumers make more informed but less wasteful purchasing decisions. For example, there's apps to virtually visualize products in your home or try on clothes, things like that. And a third one, I would say, is disclosing repairability ratings, as we've seen in France. So that's transitioning away from planned obsolescence and support a more circular economy by encouraging wholesale suppliers and retail companies to introduce a repair rating. So that would be really as part of the product's labeling for tech products, for example, such as smartphones and TVs, showing how repairable that item is.
That's an interesting one. I got to think the whole rewiring, literally and figuratively, of how we power our automobiles has got to be something lots of retailers are thinking about, because, I was in LA a couple of weeks ago, and I was looking at 4 or 5 people. Some were working out, some were, had their laptops open, all waiting to get their car charged. And it's really, even convenience stores are going to be just restructured, right? You must be very busy on that one single element of the file, yeah?
Definitely. Electrification is a huge issue, and it's definitely part of the transition to a lower carbon economy.
Now, a couple of retailers, actually this week, I think on both sides of the border here and in the U.S., announced the first electric vehicles in their fleet in terms of distribution, like in the supply chain, right? These big vehicles that are now, and I think Tesla's got some and some other providers. Are you optimistic that we can actually make a dent in the next foreseeable future with that kind of electrification of the supply chain?
Well, I do not have my crystal ball in terms of how big of a dent it will make, but for sure, changing the own fleets over to electrification will make a big dent in retailers' own greenhouse gas emissions footprint, because transportation is such a big part of emissions for retailers and for the supply chain. That definitely looking at how to convert their fleets to electric vehicles will make a big difference.
Yeah, interesting, right? All right, well, let's talk about consumers for a bit. Consumers talk a big game around sustainability. They say it's important in all the surveys, but, they do continue to shop from certain online retailers with highly questionable sustainability track records. How do we square this circle? This is not new, by the way. I mean, I was in the disposable cup business 30 years ago, and we were talking about how consumers, some made decisions solely on environmental issues, some couldn't care less, and that, where that bell curve was moving to the, making decisions with environmental issues inside or wrapped around the decision. How do you see this? It's not new, but how do we explain this paradox in consumer attitudes and behaviors? And do you see it changing over time enough to really, to really make it meaningful for retailers?
I've actually heard the same comment throughout my career as well. As one half of the world will say people won't spend more money for it, even though they want it, and the other half says it's so important to us that we will spend more money on this. But I don't actually think there is a paradox. And there are some recent reports produced by First Insight and the Baker Retailing Center at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, where the Gen Z consumer has now outsized influence on their Gen X parents and the boomer grandparents when it comes to sustainable shopping. So 90% of Gen X consumers said that they would be willing to spend an extra 10% or more for sustainable products, which has grown tremendously in the last 2 years. So Gen Z's influence will only increase as the younger members of this cohort grow into adulthood. So what we are predicting is that by 2030, Gen Z will represent a larger portion of the world's income, probably between 20 and 30%, surpassing millennials. So that will, I think, continue to drive that there will be a continued focus on purchasing sustainable products.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess recycling, full circle retail also falls in that, right? Where, Canada Goose just announced, for example, they've started a product where they're going to resell vintage or used Canada Goose jackets. So they're kind of getting in the game. So that's probably a good indicator of some positive momentum for sure. Last question for you. Two starts. It's kind of a three-part question, I guess. Last question. Two starts. One-stop advice for retailers when it comes to ESG. That's a big question for you. But, when you say, listen, if you're not doing, maybe you're doing these things, or kind of, you got to start doing these things. And the stop advice is more like maybe it doesn't work anymore, or maybe it's something you commonly see and you say, maybe you shouldn't do more of this. Any thoughts on that?
I'd say do assess ESG and climate-related risks and opportunities as soon as possible if you haven't already started along that journey. For example, evaluate circular economy as a revenue model that minimizes resource use and waste. Second, do assess additional ways to connect with consumers with the changing socioeconomic landscape. So as we mentioned, EV charging stations, also things such as product refill stations and more transparent product labeling and tracing. And I would say do more of instead of stop, but ensure ESG and climate claims are clear, accurate, substantiated, and verifiable. So really an example of that is to try and establish and enforce an internal process on ESG claims, including how they can be made and who's responsible and accountable for those claims. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, and I was going to say, and show more than tell. I mean, basically, which was your advice earlier right? It's, in other words, to avoid looking boastful, just say, listen, here's examples of what we're talking about versus a long report that maybe a few people will read, but, it's essential, but at the same time,
Stick to the facts and less storytelling.
Stick to the facts and less storytelling. There you go. I like that.
And I would say for all of these, KPMG is definitely here to help you, regardless of whatever stage you're at your ESG journey.
Well, that's a good segue into my last question. Where can listeners go to get in touch with you or learn more about what KPMG is doing? Are you a LinkedIn person? Is that a good way to get a hold of you?
I am on LinkedIn, and always happy to chat with anyone. And our KPMG ESG webpage lists our services and our contacts as well. And we have a lot of thought leadership and some help there for you as well. So definitely check us out on our webpage, and you can find me on LinkedIn.
All right. Well, I'll put links to both of those in the show notes. Teanne, thanks so much for joining me on the Voice of Retail podcast. Always interesting discussion. You've got a fascinating background, I think, right for the time, and doing interesting work. So congratulations, continued success to you and the team. And thanks again for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of The Voice of Retail. If you haven't already, be sure and follow on your favorite podcast platform so new episodes will land automatically every Friday. And check out my other retail industry media properties, America's top retail industry podcast, Remarkable Retail with Steve Dennis, and the Global E-Commerce Leaders podcast. Last but not least, if you're into barbecue, check out my YouTube barbecue show, Last Request Barbecue. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc, growth consultant and keynote speaker. If you want more content or want to chat, follow me on LinkedIn. Until then, safe travels, everyone.